In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a shadow moves through the midnight garden of Willow Cottage, digging in the dark, unearthing secrets that should have stayed buried. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, senses something sinister beneath the roses where a body lies hidden, its watch stopped at midnight. As whispers of blackmail and a scandalous past swirl, a widow's fear and a doctor's charm unravel a web of lies tied to a vanished woman and a vengeful husband. But when the truth surfaces, like roots breaking through soil, will it free the innocent or bury them deeper in a grave of secrets? Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary Meaden. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock. Life unfolded in a rhythm as familiar as the church bells on Sunday mornings. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and ivor-clad walls, stood like sentinels along the winding lanes, their gardens bursting with dahlias and chrysanthemums in the crisp autumn air. The village green, bordered by the post office and the Blue Boar Inn, was the heart of local gossip, where every glance and whisper carried the weight of unspoken judgments. It was here, in this deceptively serene setting, that Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles moving with a soft, methodical click, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she observed the world beyond, her lace-curtained windows. Miss Marple was not a woman given to idle speculation, though she had an uncanny knack for noticing the small details that others overlooked: the slant of a hat, the hesitation in a voice, the faint trace of mud on a shoe that spoke of a path not mentioned. She was elderly, with a delicate frame and a face that suggested fragility, yet her mind was as keen as the needles in her hands. To the villagers, she was a fixture, a spinster of indeterminate age, who had lived in St. Mary Mead all her life, her presence as constant as the elms that lined the high street. But to those who knew her well, she was something more: a quiet observer of human nature, whose insights into the hearts of men and women were as precise as they were unassuming. On this particular October afternoon, the light slanted through the windows, casting intricate patterns on the polished oak floor. Miss Marple's sitting room was a study in comfort and order: a chintz-covered sofa, a small mahogany table bearing a silver tea service, and a bookshelf filled with volumes of poetry and gardening manuals, alongside a well-worn copy of the Book of Common Prayer. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth fending off the autumn chill. Outside, the leaves were turning, their hues of gold and crimson a vivid contrast to the grey stone of the village. Miss Marple paused her knitting a pale blue shawl for her niece's newborn and glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for tea, and she expected a visitor. The village had been abuzz for weeks, with talk of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the new occupant of Willow Cottage, a charming but neglected property at the edge of St. Mary Mead. The cottage, once the pride of old Mrs. Harrow, had been renowned for its roses, their blooms drawing visitors from neighbouring villages. But Mrs. Harrow had passed away the previous spring, and the cottage had stood empty until Mrs. Blackwood's arrival in late August. Since then, the garden had fallen into disarray, its flower beds choked with weeds, the earth oddly disturbed, in patches, as if someone had been digging with more haste than care. The villagers, ever quick to speculate, had woven a tapestry of theories about the newcomer. She was a widow, they said, though no one knew the details of her late husband. She kept to herself, attending church but rarely lingering to chat, her dark eyes carrying a weight that invited curiosity but deflected inquiry. Miss Marple had seen Mrs. Blackwood only once, at the vicarage during a charity tea. The The widow was a striking woman, tall and slender, with pale skin and hair the color of raven's wings, pinned neatly beneath a simple hat. Her manner was reserved, almost aloof, and her voice, when she spoke, held a faint trace of an accent, perhaps northern, perhaps foreign. Miss Marple couldn't decide. She had declined a second cup of tea with a polite smile, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and excused herself early. "She's grieving," the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had whispered to Miss Marple afterward. "Poor thing, all alone in that big cottage." But Miss Marple had noted the widow's hands, not trembling with sorrow, but clenched with something closer to fear. The gossip had grown sharper in recent days. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, claimed to have seen a figure in Mrs. Blackwood's garden at midnight, digging under the cover of darkness. "It weren't natural, miss," he told the postmistress, his eyes wide with the thrill of his tale. "All shadowy, like a ghost, with a spade glinting in the moonlight." The postmistress, never one to let a story languish, had spread the tale, and by evening it had reached every corner of St. Mary Mead. Some dismissed it as boyish fancy, but others wondered. Why was the garden so disturbed? Why did Mrs. Blackwood keep her curtains drawn? And who were the strangers seen near Willow Cottage at odd hours, their faces unfamiliar to the villagers? Miss Marple, sipping her tea, considered these whispers. She was not one to leap to conclusions, but she had learned long ago that villages like St. Mary Mead were microcosms of the world, their quiet surfaces hiding currents of ambition, jealousy, and fear. She recalled her old friend, Sir Henry the retired Scotland Yard Commissioner, who had once said, "You see more from your armchair, Jane, than most detectives see in a lifetime." She smiled at the memory, her needles resuming their rhythm. The truth, she knew, lay in the details, the small, overlooked threads that, when pulled, unraveled the most tangled mysteries. The doorbell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose, smoothing her skirt. Her maid, Cherry, a cheerful young woman with a penchant for bright scarves, ushered in Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose arrival was as predictable as the post and twice as lively. Dolly, the wife of Colonel Bantry of Gossington Hall, was a robust woman with a booming voice and a heart as warm as her gossip was prolific. She swept into the room, her tweed coat slightly askew, her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk. "Jane, you simply must hear this," Dolly exclaimed, scarcely waiting for Cherry to close the door. "The most extraordinary thing. Tommy Pierce swears he saw someone digging in Mrs. Blackwood's garden last night, digging, mind you, at midnight, and not a soul should be out at that hour, not in St. Mary Mead." She flung herself onto the sofa, her hat tilting precariously. "What do you make of it? It's positively sinister." Miss Marple smiled, gesturing to the tea tray. "Do sit properly, Dolly, and have some tea. You'll give yourself a headache with all this excitement." She poured a cup, her movements deliberate, her mind already turning over the new information. "Digging, you say? How very curious. Did Tommy mention anything else?" Dolly took the cup, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, he was full of it," said the figure. Was tall, cloaked, moving like they didn't want to be seen. "He was delivering meat to the vicarage late, mind you, because his bicycle tire went flat and saw it all from the lane. He's telling everyone it's a ghost, but I say it's something else entirely. What do you think, Jane? You always see through these things." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze drifting to the window. "I think," she said slowly, "that young Tommy sees more than he understands, and less than he imagines. Boys his age are prone to embellishment, but there's often a grain of truth in their tales. A figure digging at midnight is unusual, to say the least. Did he say where in the garden? Near the roses, I think, Dolly replied, sipping her tea. You know, where Mrs. Harrow used to have those prize-winning blooms. It's all weeds now, of course. I walked by yesterday, and I swear, Jane, the ground looked like it had been turned over, not planted. Lumpy, uneven, as if someone was hiding something. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Hiding something, she repeated softly, or perhaps searching for something. Gardens, Dolly, are like people. They keep their secrets close, but they rarely stay buried. She set her cup down, her mind drifting to her own garden, where she had once found a child's toy buried under the lilacs. A clue to a long-forgotten quarrel among the village children. I think I shall take a walk past Willow Cottage this evening, she said. The air will do me good. Dolly's eyes widened. Jane, you're not thinking of poking about, are you? It's not safe, not with all this talk of midnight visitors. Why, Colonel Bantry says we ought to have the police look into it, though he's more worried about poachers on our land than ghosts in gardens. Miss Marple chuckled, a sound as soft as the rustle of leaves. The police, Dolly, have their uses, but they are not always the first to see what lies in plain sight. A walk is hardly poking about. Besides, I am an old woman, and old women are allowed their eccentricities. Her tone was light, but her eyes held a glint that Dolly knew. Well, a sign that Miss Marple's curiosity was fully engaged. As Dolly chattered on about the village fete and the vicar's latest sermon, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to Mrs. Blackwood. She recalled the widow's pale face at the vicarage, the way her fingers had tightened around her teacup when the conversation turned to her past. I came to St. Mary Mead for peace, she had said, her voice low, almost pleading. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of unspoken truths. She thought of the disturbed garden, the midnight figure, the whispers of strangers. Something was amiss at Willow Cottage, and she intended to find out what. After Dolly departed, promising to return with any fresh gossip, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, a practical black felt affair that suited the autumn chill. The evening was drawing in, the sky a deepening blue streaked with gold. She walked slowly, her stick tapping the pavement, her eyes taking in every detail. The freshly painted gate at the vicarage, the new sign at the Blue Boar, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. As she approached Willow Cottage, she slowed. Her pace, her gaze sweeping over the property. The cottage itself was charming, its stone walls softened by climbing roses, though the blooms were faded now, their petals scattered on the ground. The garden, however, was a stark contrast to the cottage's tidy exterior. The flower beds were a jumble of weeds and nettles, the earth uneven in patches, as if someone had dug and refilled without care. Near the roses, where Tommy claimed to have seen the figure, Miss Marple noted a particularly disturbed area, the soil darker and looser than the rest. A spade leaned against the wall, its blade crusted with fresh earth. Glinting faintly in the fading light, as she lingered, the gate creaked open, and a man emerged. Dr. Simon Haye, the village's new physician. He was young, perhaps 30, with a handsome face and a quick, confident stride. His coat was unbuttoned, and his tie was slightly askew, as if he had left in a hurry. He stopped short upon seeing Miss Marple, his expression shifting from surprise to a practiced smile. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. out for a stroll." "Indeed, Doctor," she replied, her voice mild. "The evening is so fine, and I find a walk clears the mind. You've been visiting Mrs. Blackwood, I presume. She's been unwell, I hear." Haye's smile tightened, just for a moment. "Yes, just a routine call. She's been under the weather, nothing serious. Needs rest, that's all." He glanced back at the cottage, his eyes lingering on the drawn curtains. "Well, I must be off. Good evening." Miss Marple watched him go, noting the slight hunch of his shoulders, the way his hand fidgeted with his hat. "Rest," she murmured to herself, "is a curious prescription for a woman who seems so alert." She turned, her attention back to the garden, her mind cataloguing the details: the spade, the disturbed earth, the doctor's unease. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London scandals, where doctors sometimes played roles less noble than their profession suggested. Dr. Haye was charming, certainly, but charm, in Miss Marple's experience, was often a mask for something less benign. As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mrs. Blackwood. The widow was a puzzle, her solitude and secrecy at odds with the openness of St. Mary Mead, and the garden. Why was it so neglected, yet so disturbed? Miss Marple recalled a long-ago incident in the village, when old Mr. Grayson had buried his savings under his apple tree, only to dig them up in a panic when he feared theft. The earth had looked much like Mrs. Blackwood's garden, uneven and betraying its secrets. But what secrets did Willow Cottage hold? And who was digging in the dead of night? Back in her drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome. She thought of the villagers, their faces, familiar yet always capable of surprise. She thought of Tommy Pierce, his boyish tale perhaps holding a kernel of truth. And she thought of Mrs. Blackwood, alone in her cottage, her past a shadow that clung to her like the ivy on her walls. "Something is buried in that garden," Miss Marple said aloud, her voice soft but certain, "and I shall find out what it is." The fire crackled, and outside, the wind stirred the leaves, whispering secrets of its own. St. Mary Mead, for all its tranquility, was stirring, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was ready to listen. Chapter 2. The Widow's Shadow. The morning after her evening stroll past Willow Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a modest spread of toast, marmalade and tea before her. The light of early October streamed through the windows of Dame Mead Cottage, illuminating the delicate china and the faint dust motes dancing in the air. Her knitting lay folded on a side table, a silent companion to her thoughts, which were occupied with the curious details of the previous evening: the disturbed earth in Mrs. Blackwood's garden, the spade with its telltale soil, and Dr. Simon Haye's hurried departure, his smile as brittle as autumn leaves. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through these fragments as one might sort through a box of old letters, seeking the one that held the key to a forgotten story. St. Mary Mead was awake, its daily rhythms as predictable as the tides. The milk cart rattled down the lane, and the postman's bicycle bell chimed faintly in the distance. Yet beneath this orderly surface, Miss Marple sensed a ripple of unease, a disturbance as subtle as a misplaced stitch in her knitting. The village was still abuzz with Tommy Pierce's tale of a midnight figure in Mrs. Blackwood's garden, and though most dismissed it as youthful exaggeration, Miss Marple knew that even the wildest stories often held a grain of truth, like a seed buried in loose soil. She resolved to learn more about the widow, whose presence in St. Mary Mead was as enigmatic as a locked diary. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had arrived in the village with little fanfare, her belongings delivered in a single van that bore no markings. She had taken up residence in Willow Cottage, a place that, despite its neglect, retained an air of faded elegance, with its stone walls and diamond-paned windows. The villagers, ever curious about newcomers, had expected her to join their small society, to attend the Women's Institute, to contribute to the church bazaar, to share a cup of tea and a snippet of her past. But Mrs. Blackwood had done none of these things. She attended Sunday service, sitting alone in a back pew, her dark eyes fixed on the stained glass window as if seeking solace in its colors. She spoke little, her replies polite but clipped, and her rare smiles seemed to carry the weight of unspoken burdens. Miss Marple had observed her closely at the vicarage tea, a fortnightly gathering where the villagers' matrons exchanged news and cakes with equal enthusiasm. Mrs. Blackwood had worn a black dress, simple but well cut, her dark hair swept into a neat chignon. Her face, pale and finely drawn, suggested a beauty that time had softened but not erased. Yet it was her hands that caught Miss Marple's attention, long-fingered, elegant but restless, twisting the handle of her teacup or smoothing her skirt with a nervous energy. When Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had asked about her life before St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Blackwood's response had been vague. "I lived in London for a time, but I prefer the quiet of the country." Her voice, soft and low, carried a trace of something foreign, though Miss Marple could not place it. Perhaps a hint of the north, or a city accent smoothed by years elsewhere. The conversation had moved on, but Miss Marple had noted the widow's tightened lips, the way her gaze darted to the door, as if she longed to escape. Now, as Miss Marple buttered her toast, she considered what little she knew of Mrs. Blackwood. A widow, alone, with no apparent family or friends to visit her. A garden left to ruin, yet disturbed by digging. A doctor who called too often, his manner betraying unease. And now, Tommy Pierce's story of a shadowy figure, spade in hand, moving through the night. Miss Marple's mind turned to her own garden, where she had once found a broken locket buried near the roses, a relic of a servant girl's heartbreak. Gardens, she thought, were like people. They held their secrets close, but they could not hide the signs of disturbance. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Cherry, her maid, ushered in Mrs. Price, the village postmistress, whose round face was alight with the fervour of fresh news. Mrs. Price was a woman of middle years, her hair perpetually escaping its pins, her apron dusted with flour from her morning baking. She was a font of village gossip, her post office a hub where letters and rumours were exchanged with equal care. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, settling into a chair without invitation. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I simply had to come. It's about Mrs. Blackwood there's talk, you know, and I thought you'd want to hear." Miss Marple smiled, pouring a second cup of tea. "You're never a disturbance, Mrs. Price. What's the village saying now?" Her tone was gentle, encouraging, but her eyes were alert, ready to catch the smallest detail. Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's that garden of hers, Miss Marple. Tommy Pierce isn't the only one who's seen things. Mrs. Weatherby, who lives across the lane, says she saw a light flickering in Mrs. Blackwood's window at all hours 2 nights ago. It was long past midnight. And then there's Mr. Gibbs, the gardener, who says he saw a man near the cottage. Not a villager, mind you, but a stranger in a city coat, loitering by the gate. He didn't like the look of him, not one bit." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Slightly a stranger, you say? Did Mr. Gibbs describe him? Tall, he said, with a rough sort of face, like he'd seen hard times. Wore a cheap suit, not quite right for the country. Mr. Gibbs thought he might be a salesman, but who comes? Selling at dusk, and to a widow who keeps to herself. Mrs. Price shook her head, her hands smoothing her apron. And then there's the letters. I shouldn't say being postmistress, but Mrs. Blackwood gets post from London, regular as clockwork, and the handwriting's not always the same. Some are in a woman's hand, some a man's. She doesn't send much herself, mind you, but she's quick to collect her mail. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing these details. Letters from London, a stranger at the gate. A light in the window, these were threads, and she would need to weave them together. And the garden, she asked, has anyone else noticed anything unusual? Mrs. Price's eyes widened. Oh yes. Mrs. Weatherby says the ground near the roses is all wrong, like it's been dug up and filled in, not proper planting. She's got an eye for gardens, you know, and she says it's no way to treat roses. I reckon she'd have a word with Mrs. Blackwood herself, but the widow's not one for visitors, keeps her door locked, and that maid of hers, Lily, is tight-lipped as they come. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to Lily, the young maid who had come with Mrs. Blackwood from London. She was a slight girl, with mousy hair and a nervous manner, rarely seen in the village except on errands. Miss Marple had spoken to her once, at the grocer's, and found her polite but guarded, her eyes darting to the floor when asked about her mistress. Lily is loyal, Miss Marple said aloud, almost to herself. But loyalty can be born of fear as much as affection. Mrs. Price nodded vigorously. That's what I said to Mrs. Weatherby. There's something not right at Willow Cottage. Mark my words. And with Dr. Haye calling so often, well, it's enough to make you wonder. He's a nice enough man, mind you, but he's got a city look about him, too. Always in a hurry, always glancing over his shoulder. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Dr. Haye, you say? Does he visit Mrs. Blackwood often? Near every day, from what I hear, Mrs. Price replied. Says she's poorly, but she doesn't look it, not when I've seen her at church. Pale, yes, but not sickly. And he gets letters, too, from London, same as her. I've seen the envelope's fine paper, but the postmarks are from all over, not just one place. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to Dr. Haye. He was a newcomer, too, having arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months before Mrs. Blackwood. He was well liked, with a charming manner and a quick smile, but Miss Marple had noticed a certain restlessness in him, a tendency to avoid direct questions about his past. She recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute, where he had deflected talk of his time in London with a joke about the city's fog. Charm, she thought, was a useful tool, but it could hide as much as it revealed. Mrs. Price stayed a while longer, sharing tidbits about the village fete and the vicar's latest sermon, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. After her guest departed, she took up her knitting, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood's hands, her guarded replies, the disturbed garden. She thought of Dr. Haye, his hurried exit from the cottage, his claim of a routine visit, and she thought of the stranger, the flickering light, the letters from London. There was a pattern here, she was certain, but it was, as yet, incomplete, like a shawl with half its stitches missing. That afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage, a gathering that promised both scones and gossip. The vicarage was a rambling house, its rooms filled with the clutter of good intentions books piled on tables, embroidery projects half finished, and a piano that no one played. Mrs. Clement greeted her warmly, her round face beaming under a halo of grey curls. The other guests included Mrs. Weatherby, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a penchant for moral pronouncements. Mrs. Blackwood was there, too, seated near the window, her black dress stark against the pale curtains. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the way she held her teacup, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The conversation was like talk of the harvest festival, the new hymenals, but Miss Marple steered it gently toward Willow Cottage. "Your garden must be a challenge, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice kind but probing. "Mrs. Harrow's roses were the pride of St. Mary Mead. Have you plans to restore them?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyes flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flash of fear. "I'm no gardener," the widow said softly, her voice low. "I leave it to Lily, but she's not skilled in such things. I came here for peace, not to tend roses." Her words were polite, but there was a finality to them. A door closed against further inquiry. Mrs. Weatherby, never one to miss an opportunity, leaned forward. "It's a pity, that garden going to ruin. I couldn't help but notice the ground near the roses. It's all uneven, as if someone's been digging. Not planting, mind you, but digging." Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple saw Mrs. Blackwood's hand tighten on her cup. "Perhaps it's the moles," Mrs. Blackwood said, forcing a smile. "They're a nuisance, I'm told." She set her cup down and rose, murmuring an excuse about a headache. As she left, Miss Marple noted the quickness of her steps, the way her hand smoothed her dress, a gesture of composure, or perhaps concealment. After tea, Miss Marple lingered, chatting with Mrs. Clement about the parish accounts, but her mind was on Mrs. Blackwood, whose departure had left a chill in the room. She thought of the widow's trembling hands, her evasive replies, the garden that seemed to whisper of secrets. She thought, too, of Dr. Haye, whose visits to Willow Cottage were more frequent than a simple illness warranted. And she thought of the stranger, the flickering light, the letters that arrived like shadows from a past life. As she walked home, the village settling into the soft hues of dusk, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her own past, to the many small mysteries she had unravelled in St. Mary Mead. There was the case of the missing brooch, solved when she noticed a maid's nervous glance at a flower pot. There was the matter of Mr. Grayson's buried savings, revealed by the uneven earth under his apple tree. And now there was Mrs. Blackwood's garden, its secrets buried but not forgotten. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her stick tapping the pavement, but her mind was swift, weaving the threads of gossip and observation into a pattern that was beginning to take shape. Back at Mead Cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The village was quiet, but Miss Marple knew that silence often hid the loudest truths. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, alone in her cottage, her past a shadow that followed her. She thought of Dr. Haye, his charm a veneer over something unspoken. And she thought of the garden, its earth disturbed, its roses neglected, its secrets waiting to be unearthed. "There is something buried at Willow Cottage," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly, "and I shall find out what it is." Chapter 3. A body unearthed. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a chill that clung to the cobblestones, the sky a pale grey streaked with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple was awake early, as was her habit, seated at her window with a cup of tea, watching the village stir to life. The milkman's cart rattled past, and the first sparrows flitted among the elms, their chatter a counterpoint to the quiet. But the calm of the morning was shattered by a commotion that reached even Mead Cottage's clamour of voices. Urgent and sharp, drifting from the direction of Willow Cottage, Miss Marple set down her cup, her senses alert. Something had happened, and she suspected it was no trifling matter. By mid-morning, the news had spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead. Young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, had been poking about in Mrs. Blackwood's garden, a dare from his mates, as boys will do when his stick struck something hard beneath the soil near the roses. Curiosity overcoming caution, he had dug deeper, only to uncover a human hand, grey and lifeless, protruding from the earth. The boy's screams had brought half the village running, and soon the lane outside Willow Cottage was crowded with onlookers, their whispers a mix of horror and fascination. The police was summoned, and Inspector Craddock, a young but capable officer from Much Benham, arrived with a small team to secure the scene. Miss Marple, informed of the discovery by a breathless Mrs. Price, who had rushed to Mead Cottage, with the news, donned her coat and hat with unhurried precision. "A body, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price exclaimed, her hands fluttering like startled birds. "Right there in Mrs. Blackwood's garden. Tommy's beside himself, poor lad, and the village is in an uproar. What can it mean?" Miss Marple's eyes were grave but calm. "It means, Mrs. Price, that we must be careful not to jump to conclusions. A body's a fact, but the story behind it is another matter entirely." She took up her stick and set out for Willow Cottage, her steps measured but purposeful. The scene at the cottage was one of controlled chaos. A cordon of rope kept the villagers at a distance, their faces a gallery of curiosity and dread. Mrs. Blackwood stood on her doorstep, her face ashen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to ward off the chill of more than just the autumn air. Inspector Craddock, his notebook in hand, was speaking to her in low tones, his expression one of professional sympathy tempered by scrutiny. Nearby, a constable guarded the garden, where two officers were carefully excavating the shallow grave. The roses, once the pride of Mrs. Harrow, stood sentinel over the grim work, their faded blooms a stark contrast to the unearthed horror. Miss Marple approached, catching Craddock's eye. He had worked with her before, on a case involving a poisoned cake at the church bazaar, and he valued her insight, though he sometimes found her methods disconcertingly indirect. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I might have known you'd be here. Care to take a look? It's not a pleasant sight, I warn you." She smiled faintly, her eyes already scanning the garden. "I've seen unpleasant things before, Inspector, and sometimes the unpleasant reveals the most." She stepped closer, guided by Craddock, and peered at the partially uncovered body. It was a man, middle-aged by the look of his clothing, a cheap suit, stained and crumpled, not suited to the country. His face was obscured by soil, but the officers had cleared enough to reveal a wrist, adorned with a cheap silver watch, its hands stopped at midnight. No wallet, no papers, no identifying marks, save the watch, which bore a faint inscription to warn to read without closer inspection. The grave was shallow, hastily dug, the earth loose and uneven, as if the burial had been done in panic. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the soil. Freshly turned, she remarked, almost to herself, "But only here, near the roses. The rest of the garden is neglected, but not disturbed in this way." This was no random burial, Inspector. Craddock nodded, his pencil poised over his notebook. That's what I thought. Whoever did this chose the spot with thorough haste. Mrs. Blackwood claims she knows nothing. Says she's been ill, keeps to her house, hasn't touched the garden. Miss Marple glanced at the widow, who stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the ground. Illness, she said softly, can be a convenient excuse, but it does not explain the spade I saw yesterday, caked with fresh soil. Craddock's eyebrows rose. You saw a spade? Where? She gestured toward the cottage wall, where the tool still leaned, its blade now cleaned, though traces of earth clung to its handle. There, yesterday evening. It was dirtier then. Someone has been tidying up. Craddock made a note, his expression tightening. I'll have it examined. Anything else you noticed, Miss Marple? She hesitated, her mind turning to Dr. Haye's hurried exit, his nervous glance toward the garden. But she said only, not yet, Inspector. But I shall keep my eyes open. She stepped back, allowing the officers to continue their work, her thoughts already weaving a pattern from the threads of the morning's events. The village was alive with speculation by noon. At the Blue Boar, where the men gathered over pence, theories abounded. The body was a vagrant, killed by a passing tramp, a thief caught in the act, or perhaps a stranger with a grudge against Mrs. Blackwood. The women, meeting at the post office or the grocer's, leaned toward darker tales perhaps. The widow had a secret lover, or a husband not so dead as she claimed. Miss Marple, stopping at the grocer's to buy a tin of biscuits, listened to the chatter, her expression one of polite interest. She knew better than to fuel the gossip, but she noted every detail. Mrs. Weatherby's claim of seeing a stranger near the cottage, Mr. Gibbs's description of a rough-faced man in a city suit, the postmistress's mention of letters to Dr. Haye. Their postmarks varied, and their handwriting unfamiliar. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. She thought of the body. Its watch stopped at midnight, a time that suggested stealth and secrecy. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, her pale face and trembling hands, her claim of illness that did not quite ring true, and she thought of Dr. Haye, whose visits to Willow Cottage were too frequent for a simple patient-doctor relationship. She recalled a case from years ago, when a young man in St. Mary Mead had buried stolen silver in his mother's garden, thinking it safe from prying eyes. The earth had betrayed him, as it had betrayed the secrets of Willow Cottage. That afternoon, she received a visit from Dolly Bantry, who burst in with her usual energy, her hat askew, and her eyes bright with excitement. Jane, it's dreadful. A body in the garden. They're saying it's murder. And Mrs. Blackwood's in a state. Colonel Bantry says it's the sort of thing you read about in detective novels, but here it is, in St. Mary Mead. She flung herself onto the sofa, fanning herself with a handkerchief. What do you make of it? You were there, weren't you? Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea. I saw the scene, Dolly. A man buried shallowly, with a watch stopped at midnight. The police are investigating, but there's much to learn. What does the village say? Dolly leaned forward, eager to share. Oh, everything. Some think it's a stranger. Others say it's someone Mrs. Blackwood knew. Mrs. Price swears she saw a man loitering near the cottage last week. And Mrs. Weatherby says the garden's been odd for weeks lumpy, like someone's been digging. And then there's Dr. Haye, always at the cottage. It's enough to make you wonder. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning over the details. Dr. Haye, she said, her voice thoughtful. He was there yesterday, leaving in a hurry. He said Mrs. Blackwood was unwell, but she seemed quite composed at the vicarage tea. Dolly's eyes widened. You don't think he's involved? Do you? He's so charming, Jane. But I suppose charm can hide a multitude of sins. Indeed it can, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. She thought of the spade, the cleaned blade, the disturbed earth. She thought of the widow's guarded manner, the stranger at the gate, the letters from London. There was a story here, buried as surely as the body in the garden, and she was determined to unearth it as evening fell. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights of Willow Cottage flicker through the trees. The village was quiet now, the excitement of the day giving way to a nervous hush. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a seed in the soil, would eventually break through. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, alone in her cottage, and of Dr. Haye, whose charm was as much a mystery as the body in the garden. And she thought of the watch, its hands frozen at midnight, a silent witness to a crime that St. Mary Mead would not soon forget. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Secret. The morning sun cast a feeble glow over St. Mary Mead, its light struggling through a veil of mist that clung to the village like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, her knitting resting in her lap, the needles silent for once as she gazed out the window. The events of the previous day, the grim discovery in Mrs. Blackwood's garden, the shallow grave, the lifeless hand with its stopped watch, had stirred the village into a frenzy of speculation. Yet Miss Marple's mind was calm, sifting through the clamour of gossip and fact with the precision of a gardener pruning a rosebush. She knew that the truth, like a hidden root, lay beneath the surface, waiting for a careful hand to uncover it. The body in the garden had been removed to the mortuary in Much Benham, and Inspector Craddock was busy with inquiries, his men combing Willow Cottage for clues. Mrs. Blackwood, pale and withdrawn, had retreated behind her drawn curtains, her solitude now a matter of necessity as much as choice. The village buzzed with theories, each more fanciful than the last, but Miss Marple paid little heed to the wilder tales. She was more interested in the quieter details, the cleaned spade she had seen by the cottage wall, Dr. Haye's nervous departure, and the whispers of a stranger seen near the gate. These were the threads she would follow, for she knew that even the smallest snag could unravel the tightest knot. Dr. Simon Haye, the village's new physician, had become a figure of particular interest. He was a man of about 30, with a lean frame and a face that combined boyish charm with a hint of weariness, as if life had pressed upon him more heavily than his years suggested. His manner was polished, his smile ready, but Miss Marple had noted a restlessness in his eyes, a flicker of unease that surfaced when he thought himself unobserved. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead 6 months earlier, taking over the practice of old Dr. Grayson, who had retired to Bournemouth. The villagers had welcomed him, charmed by his easy conversation and attentive care, but Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. Charm, in her experience, was often a veneer, and she suspected that Dr. Haye's polished exterior concealed something less benign. Her opportunity to observe him came that afternoon at the village fete, a yearly event held on the green, to raise funds for the church roof. The air was filled with the scent of baked goods and the chatter of villagers, their voices mingling with the strains of a local band playing slightly off-key. Stalls lined the green, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and guesses at the weight of a prize marrow. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and sensible hat, moved among the crowd, her stick tapping lightly on the grass, her eyes taking in every detail. The vicar's flustered attempts to organize the tombola, Mrs. Weatherby's sharp glance at a rival's Victoria sponge, and Dr. Haye, standing by the tea tent, his smile bright but his posture tense. She approached him casually, pausing to admire a display of dahlias. "Good afternoon, Dr. Haye," she said, her voice as mild as the autumn breeze. "You've chosen a fine day to enjoy the fete. I do hope you're settling into St. Mary Mead. It must be quite a change from London." Haye turned, his smile quick but not entirely natural. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Yes, it's a charming village, though I confess I'm still adjusting to the pace. London's noise does leave one rather unprepared for such quiet." He laughed, but it was a short, brittle sound, and his eyes darted toward the crowd, as if seeking an escape. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Mrs. Blackwood must find it so, too, coming from the city. I hear you've been a great help to her with her illness. It's kind of you to visit so often." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the smallest reaction. Haye's smile faltered just for a moment before he recovered. "She's had a difficult time," he said, his voice careful. "Grief can take a toll, and she's not strong. Just routine care, nothing more." He adjusted his tie, a small gesture that Miss Marple noted, for it betrayed a nervousness he could not quite conceal. "Grief is a heavy burden," she agreed, her needles clicking softly in her bag, where she kept a small ball of wool for idle moments. "But a garden can be a comfort, don't you think? Though hers seems rather neglected. I suppose she hasn't the strength for it." She paused, her gaze steady. "Or perhaps she's had other matters to occupy her." Haye's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Gardening's not for everyone," he said, his tone light but strained. "I'm sure she'll get to it in time, if you'll excuse me. Miss Marple, I must check on the first aid tent." He tipped his hat and moved away, his steps quick, his shoulders stiff. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over the encounter. Dr. Haye was uneasy, that much was clear, and his unease centered on Mrs. Blackwood. She thought of the spade, the disturbed earth, the body now lying in the mortuary. She thought, too, of the letters Mrs. Price had mentioned, arriving for both the widow and the doctor. Their postmarks varied, their handwriting unfamiliar. There was a connection here, she was certain, but it was like a half-finished pattern, in her knitting clear in parts, but incomplete. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion near the churchyard wall. She turned to see Mrs. Blackwood herself, standing apart from the crowd, her black dress a stark contrast to the bright colours of the fete. She was speaking to Dr. Haye, who had joined her behind the yew trees, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her shawl, moved closer, her steps silent on the grass. She caught only fragments of their conversation, but they were enough to sharpen her interest. "You mustn't speak of it," Mrs. Blackwood hissed, her voice low but fierce. "Not here, not now." Haye's response was inaudible, but his face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He murmured something, and Mrs. Blackwood shook her head sharply, turning away. As she did, her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment their gazes locked. The widow's expression was one of startled fear, quickly masked by a forced smile. She nodded curtly and hurried back to the fete, leaving Haye to follow, his face a study in suppressed agitation. Miss Marple returned to her stroll, her mind racing. The exchange had been brief, but telling. Mrs. Blackwood was afraid, not just of the body in her garden, but of something or someone connected to Dr. Haye, and he, for all his charm, was equally unsettled, his composure a thin veneer over a deeper unease. Miss Marple thought of her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said that the key to a crime lay in the moments when people forgot to guard their tongues. She would need to watch Dr. Haye closely, for he was hiding something, and she suspected it was more than a professional concern for his patient. That evening, as the fete wound down and the villagers drifted home, Miss Marple sat by her fire. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled a case from years ago, when a young man in St. Mary Mead had been caught stealing from the church collection, his guilt betrayed by a nervous glance at the vicar's wife, Dr. Hayes. Glance toward the garden, his hurried words to Mrs. Blackwood were not so different. There was a secret between them, she was certain, and it was tied to the body in the garden, the stopped watch, the disturbed earth. She thought, too, of the stranger seen near Willow Cottage, the rough-faced man in a city suit. Mrs. Price had mentioned letters, and now Miss Marple wondered if they held the key. She resolved to speak to her nephew, Raymond West, who was in London and could make discreet inquiries. There was a pattern here, she felt, but it was still obscured, like a garden path overgrown with weeds. She would need to tread carefully, but tread she would, for Miss Marple knew that secrets, like plants, could not stay buried forever. As the fire crackled and the village settled into the quiet of night, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, each stitch a step toward the truth. The doctor's secret, whatever it was, would not remain hidden for long, not in St. Mary Mead, where even the shadows had eyes. Chapter 5. The letters from London. The mist that had cloaked St. Mary Mead the previous day had lifted, leaving the village bathed in a crisp, golden light that made the autumn leaves glow like embers. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden at Mead Cottage, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she contemplated the unfolding mystery of Willow Cottage. The discovery of the body in Mrs. Blackwood's garden had deepened the villagers' unease, and though the police were busy with their inquiries, Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the quiet corners where officialdom rarely looked. Her thoughts were on Dr. Simon Haye, whose nervous demeanour at the fete had confirmed her suspicions of a hidden truth, and on Mrs. Blackwood, whose fear had been palpable in that fleeting glance behind the yew trees. The Morning Post brought a letter from her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a flair for the dramatic and a useful network of contacts in London. Miss Marple had written to him the previous evening, asking for discreet inquiries into Dr. Hayes' past. She had learned long ago that cities, with their bustle and anonymity, could hide secrets that villages like St. Mary Mead laid bare. Raymond's letter, written in his usual florid style, was brief but promising. Dear Aunt Jane, your request intrigues me. Dr. Simon Haye is not unknown in London circles, though his name is tied to whispers rather than facts. I've put out feelers and expect to have something concrete by week's end. Do keep me posted on your village intriguest. Mary Mead sounds positively thrilling. Miss Marple smiled at his enthusiasm, folding the letter carefully. Raymond's feelers were often more effective than he let on, and she trusted him to uncover something of value. Her musings were interrupted by a visit from Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who arrived with a basket of apples from the vicarage orchard. Mrs. Clement was a kind, if slightly disorganized woman, her grey curls perpetually escaping their pins, her conversation a stream of parish concerns and village gossip. Jane, I'm at my wit's end, she said, settling into a garden chair with a sigh. The village is in such a state over that dreadful business at Willow Cottage. And poor Mrs. Blackwood, she came to church this morning, but she looked like a ghost, barely spoke a word. I do wish she'd open up. It can't be good for her, keeping everything bottled up like that." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. "Grief can be a solitary thing," she said gently, "but so can fear. I wonder, has Mrs. Blackwood mentioned anything about her life before St. Mary Mead? Even the smallest detail might help." Mrs. Clement frowned, peeling an apple with a small knife. "Not much, I'm afraid. She said she lived in London for a time, but it was all very vague. I got the sense she didn't want to talk about it. Oh, but there was one thing she mentioned: a friend, a woman she was close to. But she stopped herself, as if she'd said too much. I didn't press her, poor dear. She looked so fragile." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. "A friend," she repeated softly. "Did she give a name?" Mrs. Clement shook her head. "No, and I didn't like to ask. But it struck me as odd she seemed almost guilty when she mentioned it." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to the letters Mrs. Price had described, some in a woman's hand, arriving for both Mrs. Blackwood and Dr. Haye. Could this friend be connected to the mystery, or was it merely a stray thread? After Mrs. Clement left, Miss Marple decided to call on Lily, Mrs. Blackwood's maid, who was known to run errands at the grocer's around midday. Lily was a young woman of perhaps 20, with a pinched face and eyes that darted nervously, as if expecting rebuke. Miss Marple found her at the shop, selecting a tin of cocoa with care. "Good morning, Lily," she said, her voice warm but deliberate. "I hope you're managing under the circumstances. It must be trying, with all this talk about the cottage." Lily started, nearly dropping the tin. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful, isn't it? I don't know what to make of it. The mistress, she's not herself, hasn't been since it happened." Her voice was low, her accent faintly Cockney, suggesting a London upbringing. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "It's a shock for everyone. You've been with Mrs. Blackwood a while, haven't you? You must know her better than most." Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening on the tin. "I suppose so, miss. I came with her from London, been with her nigh on 2 years. She's kind enough, but private, you know. Doesn't talk much about herself." "I see," Miss Marple said, selecting a packet of tea from the shelf. "I imagine you handle her correspondence, fetching the post and such. It must be a comfort to her, hearing from old friends." She watched Lily closely, noting the girl's sudden flush. "I fetch the post, yes," Lily said quickly, "but I don't read it, miss. That's not my place. She gets letters, though, regular like. And, well, I shouldn't say, but I saw her burn some in the fireplace late at night. And once I saw her with a ring, a man's ring, with letters on it, AD, I think. She hid it quick when she saw me looking." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "A ring, you say? How curious. Perhaps a keepsake from her late husband." Lily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think so, miss. She never talks about him. It's like she's afraid of something." She glanced around, as if fearing eavesdroppers, and hurried to the counter to pay. Miss Marple returned home, her mind alight with this new information. A ring with the initials AD, letters burned in the fireplace, a friend mentioned, and then dismissed. These were pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She thought of the body in the garden, the watch stopped at midnight, its inscription to warn to read. Could a D be the key? And what of Dr. Haye, whose own letters from London suggested a past he was eager to keep hidden. That evening, Raymond telephoned, his voice crackling through the line with excitement. "Aunt Jane, I've got something for you. Dr. Haye was involved in a bit of a scandal in London about 2 years ago. A woman named Clara Dunhill married to a rather volatile chap named Arthur Dunhill, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Haye was questioned. Rumor had it he was close to Clara, perhaps too close. Nothing was proven, but he left London soon after. And here's the kicker. Arthur Dunhill swore he'd tracked Haye down, hired a private investigator to follow him. I'm digging into this investigator might be your rough-faced stranger. I'll have more soon." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. Clara Dunhill, Arthur Dunhill, a private investigator. These names added weight to the threads she was weaving. Could the body in the garden be Arthur Dunhill, come to confront Haye and meeting a darker fate? Or was it the investigator, caught in a web of secrets? And where did Mrs. Blackwood fit in, with her burned letters and hidden ring? She sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. She thought of Lily's nervous glance, Mrs. Blackwood's fear, Dr. Haye's unease. She thought of the garden, its earth disturbed, its roses neglected, its secrets buried but not forgotten. "A.D.," she murmured, her voice soft but certain. A name, a clue, a shadow. From the past, we shall see what London reveals. Outside, the village settled into the quiet of night, the lights of Willow Cottage dim behind their curtains. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a letter waiting to be opened, would not stay hidden for long. She would wait for Raymond's next report, and in the meantime, she would watch and listen and knit. For in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail could unravel the deepest mystery. Chapter 6. The Midnight Visitor. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke that lingered in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting set aside for the moment. Sleep had eluded her, her mind too occupied with the threads of the mystery that had taken root in the village. The body in Mrs. Blackwood's garden, the stopped watch with its cryptic initials, the nervous glances of Dr. Simon Haye, and the whispered fears of Lily, the maid. The ring with the letters A.D., the burned letters, the stranger in the city soot-all. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the pattern was close to revealing itself, if only she could find the right thread to pull. Her window overlooked the lane that led to Willow Cottage, its silhouette just visible against the starlit sky. The village was wrapped in silence, save for the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite the hour, were fixed on the cottage, where a single light burned behind a curtained window. She had taken to watching the place these past few evenings, a habit born of instinct rather than certainty. Something was amiss at Willow Cottage, and she sensed that the night might reveal what the day concealed. At midnight, her vigilance was rewarded. A shadow moved along the lane, swift and silent, slipping through the gate of Willow Cottage, with the ease of one familiar with the path. It was a woman, cloaked and hooded, her figure indistinct but purposeful. She moved to the garden, near the roses where the body had been found, and knelt, her hands working quickly in the soil. Miss Marple leaned forward, her breath catching. The figure was digging, not with a spade but with her hands, as if searching for something small and hidden. The moonlight caught the edge of her cloak, revealing a glimpse of pale fabric beneath her. Nightdress, perhaps, suggesting haste or secrecy. Miss Marple considered her options. To call out would be foolish, alerting the figure and gaining nothing. Instead, she slipped on her coat and sturdy shoes, moving with a quiet grace that belied her years. She took her stick, more for steadiness than defense, and crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step. The night air was cold, biting at her cheeks as she stepped into the garden and made her way along the lane, keeping to the shadows of the hedgerow. By the time she reached Willow Cottage, the figure had unearthed a small object, a tin box, glinting faintly in the moonlight. The woman glanced around, her movements tense, then hurried back inside, the door closing softly behind her. Miss Marple paused by the gate, her heart steady despite the excitement of the moment. The figure had been Mrs. Blackwood. She was certain. The height, the slender frame, the nervous energy matched the widow's demeanor. But what was in the tin box, and why had she risked the night to retrieve it? Miss Marple's mind turned to Lily's tale of the ring with AD, the burned letters, the fear in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes. The box, she suspected, held a clue to the widow's past, and perhaps to the body in her garden. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts still on the midnight visitor. She decided to call on Mrs. Blackwood, ostensibly to offer sympathy for the recent upheaval. She chose a time when Lily would likely be out on errands, ensuring a private conversation. Dressed in her usual tweed and sensible hat, she walked to Willow Cottage, noting the garden's continued disarray, the roses drooping under the weight of neglect. The spade she had seen before was gone, perhaps stored away, but the earth near the roses bore fresh marks of disturbance. Subtle but unmistakable, Mrs. Blackwood answered the door herself, her face pale and drawn, her dark eyes shadowed with fatigue. She wore a simple grey dress, her hair pinned tightly, but her hands betrayed her unease, twisting a handkerchief as she invited Miss Marple inside. The sitting room was tidy but sparse, with little to suggest a life beyond the bare essentials: a sofa, a small table, a single photograph of a windswept coast, its frame unadorned. On the table, half hidden under a lace cloth, was a tin box, its surface scratched but intact. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it for a moment before she turned her attention to her hostess. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice gentle. "I thought you might be feeling the strain with all that's happened. The village can be overwhelming at such times." Mrs. Blackwood managed a thin smile, gesturing to a chair. "You're kind to call, Miss Marple. It's been difficult. The police, the questions, it's more than I expected when I came here." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "A shock for us all, I'm sure. Your garden, though it must be a comfort, even in its current state. I used to know Mrs. Harrow, who tended those roses so lovingly. Have you thought of bringing them back to life?" She watched the widow closely, noting the slight tightening of her lips. "I'm no gardener," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice low, almost defensive. "I leave such things to Lily, but she's no expert either. I came here for peace, not to dig in the dirt." Her hands clenched the handkerchief, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked. "Peace is a rare thing," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze drifting to the tin box. "Though I find a garden can reveal much about a person. Yours seems to have its secrets." She paused, her tone light but probing. "I couldn't help but notice the ground near the rose is disturbed, as if someone had been digging. Perhaps you've lost something there." Mrs. Blackwood's face paled further, her hands stilling. "Lost something," she echoed, her voice barely a whisper, No eye. It's just the state of the place. I haven't had time to tend it." She rose abruptly, smoothing her dress. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I'm not feeling well. Thank you for your visit." Miss Marple stood, her smile unchanged. "Of course, my dear. Do take care." As she left, she glanced once more at the tin box, its presence a silent confirmation of her suspicions. Mrs. Blackwood was hiding something, and the midnight digging suggested it was something she feared to lose or to have found. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. She considered the tin box, the initials AD, the letters from London. She thought of Dr. Haye, whose frequent visits to the cottage were more than professional courtesy, and of Raymond's report of a scandal involving Clara Dunhill and her volatile husband, Arthur. Was the ring Lily mentioned Arthur Dunhill's, a relic of a past Mrs. Blackwood wished to forget? And what of the body in the garden? Its watch stopped at midnight, a time that echoed the hour of Mrs. Blackwood's nocturnal search. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, each stitch a step toward clarity. She recalled a case from her youth, when a neighbor's wife had buried a locket in her garden, a gift from a forbidden love, only to dig it up in panic when her husband grew suspicious. The earth had betrayed her, as it had betrayed Mrs. Blackwood. A tin box, Miss Marple murmured, and a midnight visitor. The widow was afraid, but of what or whom? She resolved to speak to Inspector Craddock, to suggest a closer look at the garden, and to await Raymond's next report from London. The truth, she knew, was close, like a seed stirring beneath the soil, ready to break through. Outside, the village lay quiet, the lights of Willow Cottage dim and secretive. But Miss Marple's eyes were open, her mind weaving the threads of fear and secrecy into a pattern that would soon reveal the heart of the mystery. Chapter 7. The Ring and the Watch. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a sharpness that hinted at winter's approach. The sky, a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Mead Cottage, her knitting, needles moving with their steady rhythm, though her thoughts were far from the pale blue shawl taking shape in her lap. The mystery of Willow Cottage had deepened with her glimpse of Mrs. Blackwood's midnight digging. The tin box, a tantalizing clue to secrets buried both in the garden and in the widow's past. The body unearthed near the roses, the stopped watch, the ring with the initials A. These were threads in a tapestry that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. Stitch by careful stitch, Inspector Craddock called shortly after breakfast, his face wary but alert, the strain of the investigation evident in the lines around his eyes. He accepted a cup of tea with a nod of thanks, settling into a chair as Miss Marple observed him with her usual quiet scrutiny. "We've had some developments," he said, flipping open his notebook. "The watch on the body 8's got an inscription, faint but legible, to a D with love. No date, no other names. The coroner says the man was killed about a week ago, likely a blow to the head. No identification yet, but we're checking missing persons in London and nearby." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes sharpening. "AD," she murmured. "The same initials as the ring Lily mentioned, the one Mrs. Blackwood hid. Have you searched the cottage for it?" Craddock shook his head. "Not yet. We need more evidence to justify a warrant. Mrs. Blackwood's sticking to her story, says she's been ill. Hasn't left the house much. Knows nothing about the body. But she's nervous, I can tell. Keeps looking at the garden when she thinks I'm not watching." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the tin box she had seen, its scratched surface glinting in the moonlight. "A nervous woman is often a guilty one," she said softly, "but guilt comes in many forms. She may be hiding something, but not necessarily a murder." "Have you spoken to Dr. Haye again? His visits to the cottage seem rather frequent for a simple illness." Craddock's expression tightened. "I have. He's cooperative, up to a point. Says Mrs. Blackwood's been under strain, needed sedatives. But he's cagey about his own movements. Claims he was at home the night we estimate the murder happened, but no one can confirm it. And there's something else the chemist mentioned. He's been buying sedatives regularly, more than you'd expect for one patient." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Sedatives," she repeated. "A useful tool for calming nerves or ensuring compliance. I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the garden itself. The earth near the roses is disturbed, more so since the body was found. I saw Mrs. Blackwood there, late at night, retrieving a tin box. It may hold something significant, letters perhaps, or that ring." Craddock leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A tin box? You're sure?" Miss Marple nodded, describing the scene with her usual precision. The cloaked figure, the hurried digging, the glint of metal in the moonlight. "I'll look into it," Craddock said, making a note. "But without a warrant, we're limited. Anything else you've noticed, Miss Marple? You've a knack for seeing what we miss." She smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "Only the people reveal themselves in small ways, Inspector. A glance, a gesture, a word out of place. Dr. Haye's charm is a mask, I think, and Mrs. Blackwood's fear is more than grief. The ring and the watch, they point to a name, a D, and a story that began long before St. Mary Mead." She paused, her needles resuming their click. "My nephew, Raymond, is making inquiries in London. He may have more on Dr. Haye's past soon." Craddock thanked her and left, promising to keep her informed. Miss Marple turned her attention to the Women's Institute meeting that afternoon, a gathering that promised both tea and gossip. The village hall was a hive of activity, with tables laden with scones and jam, the air thick with the chatter of women who knew every detail of St. Mary Mead's daily life. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the back, her knitting in hand, her ears attuned to the undercurrents of conversation. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was in fine form, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "I was saying to Mrs. Weatherby, it's no wonder Mrs. Blackwood keeps to herself with a body in her garden. But I saw something odd. A few weeks back a man, not from here, arguing with her near the cottage gate, rough-looking, in a cheap suit, like he'd come from the city. I didn't catch what they said, but she looked frightened, and he was waving his hands, all angry-like." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind seizing on this new detail. "Did you recognize him, Mrs. Price?" she asked, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. Mrs. Price shook her head. "Never seen him before, but he wasn't the sort you forget. Hard face, like he'd seen trouble. I told Mr. Gibbs, the gardener, and he said he'd seen a man like that, too, loitering near the cottage at dusk." The conversation shifted to the fate, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained on the rough-faced man. Could he be the private investigator Raymond had mentioned, hired by Arthur Dunhill to track Dr. Haye? And if so, was he the man now lying in the mortuary, his watch stopped at midnight, his initials AD etched in silver? She thought of the ring Lily had seen, hidden by Mrs. Blackwood, and the tin box, unearthed in the dead of night. The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was still incomplete. Like a shawl with a dropped stitch, That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm against the quiet. She thought of the watch, its inscription a whisper of a past love, and the ring a secret Mrs. Blackwood feared to reveal. She thought of Dr. Haye, his sedatives a tool of control, and the stranger whose argument with the widow suggested a threat she could not escape. "A.D.," she murmured, her voice soft but certain. "A name that binds them all, Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Haye, and the man in the garden. But whose name and whose guilt?" She resolved to press Raymond for more details and to keep a close eye on Willow Cottage. The ring and the watch were clues, but the tin box, she felt, held the key. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like seeds, buried deep but destined to surface, and Miss Marple was determined to see them bloom. Chapter 8. The past resurfaces. Autumn days in St. Mary Mead grew shorter, the light fading earlier each evening, casting long shadows across the village lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room at Mead Cottage, a fire crackling. In the hearth, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The mystery of Willow Cottage had taken on a sharper edge with the discovery of the body. The watch inscribed with a D, and the ring Lily had seen in Mrs. Blackwood's possession. The midnight digging, the tin box, Dr. Haye's uneasies, were threads in a tapestry that Miss Marple was piecing together, her mind as keen as the needles in her hands. The village buzzed with speculation, but she preferred the quiet of her own thoughts, where the smallest details could bloom into revelations. A letter from her nephew, Raymond West, arrived with the morning post, its contents as illuminating as she had hoped. Raymond's inquiries in London had borne fruit, and his words, though tinged with his usual flair, carried a weight that quickened Miss Marple's pulse. "Dear Aunt Jane," he wrote, "your Dr. Haye is a man with shadows. The scandal I mentioned, Clara Dunhill's disappearance, cast a long one. She vanished 2 years ago, leaving her husband, Arthur Dunhill, a man of volatile temper, convinced of Haye's involvement. Dunhill hired a private investigator, one Harold Vance, to track him. Vance was a rough sort, known for dogged persistence and a taste for blackmail. He followed Haye to St. Mary Mead, and here's the twist. Vance hasn't been seen in London since. I've a contact digging into Dunhill's whereabouts alive and in Bristol. Last I heard, more to follow." Miss Marple folded the letter, her eyes narrowing. Harold Vance, the rough-faced man in the cheap suit described by Mrs. Price and Mr. Gibbs, matched the profile of the stranger seen arguing with Mrs. Blackwood. Could he be the body in the garden? His watch inscribed with a deeper Hapsa gift from a past he had exploited. And what of Arthur Dunhill, whose name carried the same initials? The ring, the watch, the tin box, they pointed to a web of connections that stretched from London to St. Mary Mead, binding Mrs. Blackwood and Dr. Haye in ways yet to be fully understood. She decided to visit Inspector Craddock, who was stationed temporarily at the Blue Boar Inn, coordinating the investigation. The inn's parlour, usually a place of jovial chatter, was subdued, the weight of the murder hanging over the village like a storm cloud. Craddock welcomed her, his notebook open, his face a mix of frustration and respect. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a chair, "you've a knack for turning up when I need a fresh perspective. We're hitting walls, no identification on the body yet, though we suspect he's not local. The watch is our best lead, but a D could be anyone." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her hands folded neatly. "Perhaps not anyone, Inspector. I've had word from my nephew in London. Dr. Haye was linked to a scandal involving a woman, Clara Dunhill, who disappeared 2 years ago. Her husband, Arthur Dunhill, note, the initials, hired a private investigator, Harold Vance, to follow Haye. Vance was seen in St. Mary Mead, arguing with Mrs. Blackwood. He fits the description of the stranger Mrs. Price saw, a rough man in a city suit. Craddock's pencil paused, his eyes sharpening. Vance, you say? That's a lead worth chasing. And this Arthur Dunhill, he's still alive? Miss Marple nodded. In Bristol, according to my nephew. But Vance hasn't been seen since. Coming here, it's possible he's our man in the garden, killed for what he knew or what he demanded. Craddock made a note, his expression grim. Blackmail's a nasty business. If Vance was pressing Mrs. Blackwood or Haye, it could explain a lot. She's been cooperative, but cagey. I questioned her again yesterday. She admitted knowing Vance, said he came to the cottage, demanding money. Claims it was about her past. In London, nothing to do with the murder. She says he left after their last meeting, alive and well. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. And yet a body was buried in her garden, Inspector. Mrs. Blackwood's fear is genuine, I think, but whether it's of guilt or something else remains to be seen. Have you searched for the tin box I mentioned? It may hold answers. Craddock shook his head. No warrant yet, but we're watching the cottage. Haye's another matter. He's sticking to his story about routine visits. But the chemist's records show he's bought enough sedatives to keep half the village asleep. I'm starting to wonder what he's really up to. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the heated exchange she had overheard at the fete. Dr. Haye is hiding something, she said softly. His charm is a mask, and masks slip in time. Mrs. Blackwood's fear may be tied to him as much as to Vance. I suggest you keep an eye on both, Inspector, and perhaps ask Lily, the maid, about that ring again. She's nervous, but she sees more than she says. Craddock thanked her, promising to follow up, and Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts a whirl of names and motives. Arthur Dunhill, Harold Vance, Clara Dunhill, their stories were intertwined. And Mrs. Blackwood was at the heart of it, her tin box a silent witness to secrets she dared not share. Miss Marple thought of the ring, the watch, the initials, a dear coincidence. Perhaps, but in her experience, coincidences were often clues in disguise. That afternoon, she attended a knitting circle at the vicarage, a gathering that offered more gossip than needlework. Mrs. Weatherby, ever observant, mentioned seeing Dr. Haye leave Willow Cottage late the previous evening, his face pale and his coat unbuttoned, as if in haste. It's odd, she said, her needles clicking furiously. He's there so often, you'd think Mrs. Blackwood was at death's door. But she was at church yesterday, looking tired but not ill. Miss Marple nodded, her own needles moving steadily, her mind cataloguing this new detail as evening fell. She sat by her fire, the village quiet beyond her windows. She thought of Harold Vance, a blackmailer who had come to St. Mary Mead and met his end. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, her midnight digging a desperate act to protect her concealer secret. And she thought of Dr. Haye, whose sedatives and frequent visits suggested a role beyond that of a concerned physician. The past resurfaces, she murmured, her needles clicking like a metronome. And with it, the truth. She resolved to await Raymond's next report, to watch Willow Cottage, and to speak to Lily again. For the maid's fear held a key. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like ripples in a pond, spreading outward until they touched every shore, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to their source. Chapter 9. The Garden's Secret, The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village and lending an air of secrecy to its quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Mead Cottage, her knitting needles. Idle for once, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond her window. The mystery of Willow Cottage had grown more intricate with each passing day. The threads of the case, Mrs. Blackwood's midnight digging, the tin box, the ring with the initials A.D., and the body with its stopped watch, weaving a pattern that was both compelling and elusive. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as ever, turned over these details, seeking the connection that would bring clarity to the shadows. Her conversation with Inspector Craddock had confirmed her suspicions about Harold Vance, the private investigator, whose rough features matched the stranger seen near Willow Cottage. Raymond's letter had painted a picture of a man prone to blackmail, hired by Arthur Dunhill to pursue Dr. Simon Haye over a scandal involving Clara Dunhill's disappearance. The initials A.D., found on both the watch and the ring, suggested a link to Arthur, but Miss Marple was not yet convinced that the body was his. Vance, she thought, was the more likely candidate. His presence in St. Mary Mead, a threat that someone, perhaps Mrs. Blackwood or Dr. Haye, had silenced permanently. Determined to uncover more, Miss Marple sought permission from Inspector Craddock to revisit the garden at Willow Cottage. He agreed, albeit with a wry smile, accustomed to her unerring instinct for finding what others overlooked. "Just don't disturb the scene, Miss Marple," he said, handing her a pair of gloves. "And if you find anything, let me know before you start digging." She nodded, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "I'm an old woman, Inspector. My digging days are long past, but my eyes are as good as ever." She arrived at Willow Cottage in the late morning, the air crisp and the garden silent, its roses drooping under the weight of neglect. The police had cordoned off the area where the body was found, but Miss Marple's interest lay elsewhere near the roses, where she had seen Mrs. Blackwood unearth the tin box. The earth there was softer than the rest, its surface disturbed by more than the widow's midnight search. Kneeling carefully, her gloves protecting her hands, she probed the soil with a small trowel borrowed from her own garden. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the act of a woman who knew that secrets, like seeds, were often buried just beneath the surface. After a few minutes, her trowel struck something solid. She brushed away the soil to reveal the tin box, its scratched surface dulled by dirt, but unmistakable. It was small, no larger than a biscuit tin, its lid rusted but intact. Miss Marple glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then carefully lifted it from the earth. She did not open it, that was a task for the police, but she noted its weight. Heavier than she expected, suggesting contents beyond mere paper. She placed it on the grass and called for the constable stationed at the gate, who hurried over, his eyes wide with surprise. "Inspector Craddock will want to see this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It was buried here, near the roses. I suspect it holds something Mrs. Blackwood wished to keep hidden." The constable nodded, taking the box with care, and Miss Marple returned home, her mind alight with possibilities. The box, she felt, was the key to the garden's secret, a link between the widow's fear and the body in the grave. That afternoon, Craddock arrived at Mead Cottage, the tin box in a sealed bag, his expression a mix of gratitude and exasperation. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple," he said, setting the bag on her table. "We opened it letters mostly, and a photograph. The letters are from Clara Dunhill to Mrs. Blackwood, written years ago, before Clara's disappearance. They're personal, intimate even, suggesting a close friendship." The photograph shows Mrs. Blackwood Eleanor Gray. She was then with a man we think is Arthur Dunhill. And there's a ring engraved with a D. It matches Lily's description. Miss Marple's needles resumed their click, her mind racing. Eleanor Gray, she said softly. So Mrs. Blackwood had a life before her marriage, one tied to Clara and Arthur Dunhill. The letters, did they mention Dr. Haye? Craddock shook his head. Not directly, but they hint at a scandal. Something Clara feared would ruin her. Mrs. Blackwood's been questioned again. She broke down, admitted the letters were from Clara, said Vance was blackmailing her over them. Claims she paid him to keep quiet about her past, but swears she didn't kill him. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. A woman protecting. Her past is one thing, Inspector, but a woman protecting someone else is another. I wonder if Dr. Haye's role is more than that of a concerned physician. His sedatives, his frequent visits, perhaps he was ensuring her silence as much as her health. Craddock made a note, his brow furrowed. You think Haye's involved? He's slippery, I'll give you that. We're checking his alibi again, and we've sent the ring and watch for further analysis. If Vance was the victim, it explains the body, but not the motive. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the photograph, the letters, the ring. Eleanor Gray, friend to Clara Dunhill, lover to Arthur Dunhill, perhaps. And now a widow in St. Mary Mead, haunted by a past that had followed her to the village. The tin box was her attempt to bury that past, but the garden had betrayed her, as gardens often did. Miss Marple recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a young woman had hidden love letters in a tin under her father's apple tree, only to have them found by a curious child. Secrets, she knew, had a way of surfacing as evening fell. She sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm against the quiet. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, her fear a shadow cast by a life left behind. She thought of Dr. Haye, whose charm hid a darker purpose. And she thought of the garden, its secret unearthed but not yet fully revealed. The past resurfaces, she murmured, her needles clicking softly, and with it, the truth. She resolved to speak to Lily again, to press for more about the ring, and to await Raymond's next report on Arthur Dunhill's movements. The garden secret was out, but the mystery of Willow Cottage was far from solved, and Miss Marple knew that the final pieces were waiting, like seeds ready to break through the soil. Chapter 10. The doctor's confession. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Mead Cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their accustomed rhythm. The air held a chill, a reminder of autumn's deepening hold on St. Mary Mead, but the fire in the hearth kept the room warm, its crackle a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. The mystery of Willow Cottage had reached a critical juncture. The tin box, unearthed from the garden, had revealed letters and a photograph linking Mrs. Blackwood, once Eleanor Gray, to Clara and Arthur Dunhill, while the ring and watch, both inscribed with a D, pointed to a past that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, was weaving these threads into a pattern, and she sensed the truth was near, like a bud ready to bloom. Inspector Craddock had called earlier that morning, his voice taut with the strain of the investigation. The body in the garden had been identified as Harold Vance, the private investigator hired by Arthur Dunhill to track Dr. Simon Haye. The cause of death, a blow to the head, suggested a sudden, violent act, and the shallow grave spoke of panic. Rather than planning, Mrs. Blackwood's admission of blackmail had shifted suspicion onto her. But Miss Marple's instincts told her the widow's fear was not that of a murderer. Dr. Haye, with his frequent visits and liberal use of sedatives, was a more likely candidate, his charm a mask that was beginning to slip. Determined to press the matter, Craddock summoned Dr. Haye to the police station in Much Benham for a formal interview. Miss Marple invited to observe as a courtesy to her invaluable insights. Arrived at the station in the early afternoon, her black felt hat and tweed coat giving her the air of a harmless village spinster. The interview room was stark, its bare walls and single table a contrast to the cosy clutter of St. Mary Mead. Haye sat across from Craddock, his hands clasped tightly, his usual smile replaced by a tense, guarded expression. Miss Marple took a seat in the corner, her knitting in her lap, her eyes missing nothing. Craddock began with a directness that belied his youth. "Dr. Haye, we've identified the body as Harold Vance, a private investigator from London. He was blackmailing Mrs. Blackwood, and we know he was looking into your past, specifically your connection to Clara Dunhill. You were seen at Willow Cottage often, far more than a doctor's duties require. Care to explain?" Haye's jaw tightened, his fingers fidgeting with a cufflink. "I've told you, Inspector. I was treating Mrs. Blackwood for nervous exhaustion. She's been under strain, what with her husband's death, and now this. Tragedy in her garden. As for Vance, I barely knew him. He came to the cottage once, asking questions about London. I sent him on his way." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a sound that seemed to punctuate the silence. She spoke, her voice mild but pointed. "And yet, Doctor, you were seen leaving Willow Cottage in haste, the evening before the body was found. Your visits, your sedatives, Mrs. Blackwood seems more controlled than calmed. And Vance, I understand, was a persistent man. Did he press you about Clara Dunhill, perhaps? A scandal that followed you here?" Haye's eyes flicked to her, a flash of panic quickly masked. "Clara Dunhill. That was years ago, a misunderstanding. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I left London to start fresh, that's all." His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, clenching until the knuckles whitened. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Vance was killed a week ago, Dr. Haye. You claim you were home that night, but no one can confirm it. We found sedatives in Mrs. Blackwood's system, more than necessary for nervous exhaustion, and the tin box, with letters linking her to Clara and Arthur Dunhill. Did you know about it? Did you help her hide it?" Haye's composure cracked, his face paling. I knew about the letters. Eleanor Mrs. Blackwood told me Vance was blackmailing her, threatening to expose her past with the Dunhills. I advised her to pay him, to keep him quiet, but I didn't kill him, I swear." His voice rose, a note of desperation creeping in. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes steady on him. "You advised her to pay, Doctor, but did you act to protect her? Vance was a threat to you both, wasn't he? Not just to her past, but to yours. Clara Dunhill's disappearance left questions, and you left London to escape them. Did Vance come too close to the truth?" Haye's shoulders slumped, his hands covering his face. "It wasn't planned," he said, his voice muffled. "Vance came to the cottage that night, demanding more money. He'd found out about Clara said. He had proof I was involved. He attacked Eleanor, grabbed her arm. I acted in... I hit him with a shovel, didn't mean to kill him. When I realized he was dead, I panicked, buried him in the garden. Eleanor helped. She was terrified, didn't know what else to do. Craddock's pencil scratched furiously, his eyes narrowing. "You buried him, and you kept her quiet with sedatives, didn't you? To control her, to make sure she didn't talk." Haye nodded, his face ashen. "I thought it would protect us both. I was wrong." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. Haye's confession explained Vance's death, but the shadow of Clara Dunhill lingered. "And Clara," she asked softly, "what truth was Vance so close to?" Haye's eyes met hers, haunted. "I loved her," he whispered. "She threatened to tell her husband about us. I lost my temper. It was an accident, in London, 2 years ago. I never meant to hurt her." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like dust. Craddock stood, signaling for a constable. "Dr. Simon Haye, you're under arrest for the murder of..." Harold Vanson will be looking into Clara Dunhill's death as well. As Haye was led away, his head bowed, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched. The doctor's confession had unravelled one thread, but the tapestry was not yet complete. Mrs. Blackwood's role, her fear, her silence there was more to uncover. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her needles resuming their rhythm. She thought of Haye's desperation, his attempt to bury his past in the garden. She thought of Mrs. Blackwood, caught in a web of fear and loyalty. "The truth comes out," she murmured, "but not all of it. Not yet." She resolved to speak to the widow, to find the final pieces of the puzzle. For, in St. Mary Mead, even the deepest secrets could not stay buried forever. Chapter 11. The Widow's Truth. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a deepening indigo, the stars beginning to prick through as the village settled into its customary hush. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire at Mead Cottage, the glow casting soft shadows across the room, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. Dr. Simon Haye's confession had unravelled a significant thread of the mystery at Willow Cottage. Harold Vance, the private investigator, had been killed in a moment of panic, his body buried in the widow's garden to conceal a crime rooted in a London scandal. Yet Miss Marple knew the tapestry was not complete. Mrs. Blackwood Eleanor Grey, as she had once been, remained an enigma, her fear and silence hinting at truths still buried, like roots beneath the disturbed earth of her garden. Dr. Haye's arrest had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, the villagers' whispers now tinged with shock and a certain grim satisfaction at the unmasking of a charming facade. But Miss Marple's mind was on Mrs. Blackwood, whose role in the affair was unclear. The tin box, with its letters from Clara Dunhill, and the photograph of Eleanor with Arthur Dunhill, suggested a past entwined with both the victim and the murderer. The ring, inscribed with a D, hidden and then unearthed, pointed to a connection that went beyond mere blackmail. Miss Marple suspected the widow's fear was not of guilt, but of something or someone she could not escape. Determined to hear the widow's truth, Miss Marple resolved to visit Willow Cottage the next morning. She chose a time when Lily, the maid, would be at the market, ensuring a private conversation. Dressed in her familiar tweed skirt and black felt hat, she walked the short distance to the cottage, her stick tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The garden, still cordoned off by police tape, looked forlorn in the morning light, its roses drooping as if mourning the secrets they had guarded. The spade, once caked with soil, was gone, likely taken as evidence. But the earth near the roses bore the scars of recent digging, a silent testament to the drama that had unfolded. Mrs. Blackwood opened the door herself, her face pale and drawn, her dark eyes hollow with exhaustion. She wore a simple grey dress, her hair loosely pinned, as if she had given up on appearances. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and weary, "I suppose I should have expected you. Come in." Her tone was resigned, but there was a flicker of relief, as if she had been waiting for someone to break the silence she had kept. The sitting room was as sparse as before. The tin box no longer on the table, now in police custody. Miss Marple took a seat, her hands folded neatly, her eyes gentle but piercing. "I won't keep you long, Mrs. Blackwood," she said softly, "but with Dr. Haye's arrest, I thought you might wish to share your side of things. The truth has a way of easing burdens, you know." Mrs. Blackwood's hands twisted together, her lips trembling. "The truth," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been running from it for years. I never meant for any of this, Vance. The garden, Simon." She sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "I was Eleanor Grey in London before I married. Clara Dunhill was my friend, my closest friend. We shared everything, hopes, fears, secrets. Arthur, her husband, was difficult, jealous. I loved him, though, for a time. It was wrong, I know, but I couldn't help it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "And the letters, the ring?" she prompted gently, her voice as soothing as the click of her needles. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. The letters were from Clara, written before she disappeared. They spoke of her fear of Simon Dr. Haye. She loved him, but she was going to tell Arthur about their affair. I warned her not to, but she wouldn't listen. Then she was gone. And I suspected Simon, but I had no proof. The ring was Arthur's, a gift from Clara. I kept it after he left me, a foolish keepsake. When Vance came, he knew about my past with Arthur, threatened to tell the village, to ruin me. I paid him, but he kept coming back." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. "And Dr. Haye, he knew about Vance, didn't he?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded, a sob escaping her. "He said he'd handle it, that he'd protect me. I didn't know he'd kill him." That night, Vance came to the cottage, angry, demanding more money. Simon was there. He struck Vance, and I helped bury him. I was so frightened, Miss Marple. Simon gave me sedatives, said they'd help, but they made me foggy, obedient. I was trapped. Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly. "On the widows, you were afraid," she said gently. "Fear makes us do things we regret. The tin box, you buried it to protect those letters, didn't you?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought if I hid them, no one would know about Clara, about Arthur. But Simon, he used my fear to keep me quiet." Miss Marple sat back, her mind weaving the final threads. Mrs. Blackwood had been a pawn, caught between her past and Haye's. Guilt. The ring, the letters, the photograph, they were relics of a love and a friendship that had led to tragedy. "You've done well to tell me," she said softly. "The police will need to hear this, but I believe you're no murderer. My dear, you were protecting yourself as best you could." Mrs. Blackwood's sobs quieted, her shoulders sagging with relief. Miss Marple rose, her stick tapping softly as she prepared to leave. "The truth is a hard thing," she said, "but it sets us free in time." As she walked home, the village waking to its daily rhythms, she thought of the garden, its secrets. Laid bare, she thought of Dr. Haye, whose confession had revealed a double guilt, and of Mrs. Blackwood, whose truth had lifted a weight from her heart. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking, like a metronome. The mystery was nearly solved, but one question lingered. What had become of Clara Dunhill? She resolved to press Raymond for more, but for now, the widow's truth was enough. In St. Mary Mead, secrets bloomed like weeds, but Miss Marple knew how to tend them, until only the truth remained. Chapter 12. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. Autumn dusk settled over St. Mary Mead with a gentle inevitability. The sky a tapestry of deepening blues and fading golds, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire. At Dame Mead Cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, the pale blue shawl in her lap nearly complete. The mystery of Willow Cottage had unravelled, its secrets laid bare like the roots of the roses in Mrs. Blackwood's garden. Dr. Simon Haye's arrest for the murder of Harold Vance, and his confession to the earlier killing of Clara Dunhill, had brought a grim resolution to the village's turmoil. Mrs. Blackwood Eleanor Grey had been cleared of murder, her role reduced to that of a frightened accomplice, her silence born of fear rather than guilt. Yet the village, though quiet once more, bore the lingering echoes of the scandal, its gossip a soft hum beneath the surface. Miss Marple's thoughts, as she knitted, were on the widow, who had left St. Mary Mead that morning, her belongings packed into a single van, much as they had arrived. She had confided in Miss Marple before her departure, her voice soft but resolute. "I came here for peace," she had said, standing in the doorway of Willow Cottage, her dark eyes weary but clear. "But I brought my past with me, and it nearly destroyed me. I'm going north, to start again truly this time." Miss Marple had nodded, her hand resting lightly on the widow's arm. "The past is a heavy burden," she had replied, "but a new beginning is always possible. Take care, my dear." As the van pulled away, Miss Marple had watched it go, her heart heavy but hopeful, for she believed in second chances, even for those who had stumbled. The village had returned to its rhythms, the church bells ringing for evensong, the milk cart rattling down the lane, the sparrows flitting among the elms. But the memory of the body in the garden, the stopped watch, the tin box with its secrets, lingered in the collective mind of St. Mary Mead. At the Blue Boar, the men spoke of Dr. Haye's downfall with a mix of awe and disapproval, while the women at the post office debated Mrs. Blackwood's innocence, their voices hushed but eager. Miss Marple, knitting by her fire, listened to these whispers when they reached her, brought by Mrs. Price or Mrs. Clement, but she offered little in return. The truth, she knew, was a delicate thing, best handled with care. Dolly Bantry called. That afternoon, her arrival as lively as ever, her hat askew and her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jane, it's all over, isn't it?" she said, flinging herself onto the sofa. "Dr. Haye arrested, Mrs. Blackwood knits like a novel, but right here in St. Mary Mead. You saw it all coming, didn't you? How do you do it, miss?" Marple smiled, pouring tea with her usual precision. "I don't see, Dolly, so much as observe. People bury their secrets, as Mrs. Blackwood buried her letters. But a garden, like a conscience, rarely keeps them hidden." Dolly leaned forward, her teacup forgotten. "But that ring, the watch, the letters, how did you know they'd lead to Haye?" And poor Mrs. Blackwood, caught up in it all. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her voice calm but thoughtful. It was the initials, Dolly A.D., on the ring and the watch. They pointed to Arthur Dunhill, but also to a past that bound Mrs. Blackwood and Dr. Haye. Her fear was not of guilt. but of a man who controlled her with sedatives and secrets. The garden told the story in its disturbed earth and neglected roses. Dolly shook her head, marveling. "You're a wonder, Jane. The village is quiet again, but I wager it won't last. Something's always stirring in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple chuckled, a sound as soft as the rustle of leaves. "Villages are like gardens, Dolly. They seem peaceful, but there's always something growing beneath the surface." As Dolly left, promising to return with news of the next fate, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the last light fade from the sky. She thought of the garden at Willow Cottage, its roses now untended, its secrets unearthed. She thought of Dr. Haye, whose charm had hidden a double guilt, and of Mrs. Blackwood, whose truth had set her free, if only to face a new solitude. And she thought of Clara Dunhill, a ghost in the story, whose disappearance had set the tragedy. In motion, the fire crackled, its warmth a comfort against the evening chill. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, each stitch a testament to her patience, her insight, her quiet resolve. St. Mary Mead was peaceful once more, its lanes and cottages bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. But Miss Marple knew that peace was fleeting, that new mysteries would take root, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. For now, she was content to knit, to watch, to wait, for in the quiet of St. Mary Mead, the truth was never far from the surface. The end.